As an overview, I'll address why form matters, common errors in form, components of good form, do a case study of myself analyzing form, which also will give you a bit of a preview of what we do as a team, which offers running form analysis to people, and then talk about the steps to optimizing form. I'm not just talking from purely experience and my own study, but also, research. There has been different studies done at different levels. There's a lot of variance in it, but trying to draw from what the science has concluded, which there's still much to learn because running form is quite actually subjective. That's why we'll get more into principles. And when it really comes down to applying to you and your form, there's going to be a range of subjectivity in terms of understanding strengths and vulnerabilities. But I want to address the principles to begin with because these guide us in a general sense. Form matters because of two main things. It influences your performance and it can influence longevity, how long you'll be able to run in life, basically. At a performance level, research and just experience can affirm the sense of the better your form is, the energy, your systems in your body are working at a better level, especially when it comes to economy or endurance. One thing that's been studied a bit more is oxygen. How is oxygen processed in the body, measured by VO2 max? So runners with good economy tend to use less oxygen than those with poor economy. Optimizing your form is helping all the systems internally also work at their best. And so with that, speed is a huge element of performance, heavily influenced by biomechanics, which looks at angles of joints, bones, how things are contacting and moving across the ground. And so the better their form, ultimately, the better speed you're able to run. I want to note that muscle strength is a major component for speed, in some sense, more than the biomechanics. And so while speed is influenced, which is the motor control element, how the brain and the body are interacting, muscle strength doesn't necessarily improve as a result of improving your form. The way to think about muscle strength is it supports the improvement of form. So what we'll get into and what Eric works a lot with people with injuries on is strengthening things so that they're working more optimally and supporting better mechanics, essentially, which then supports better speed and supports better endurance. So muscle strength is less of an outcome from running form, unlike speed and endurance, but it's something that's absolutely essential to support improving running performance and running form. The main other thing is just longevity, reducing the risk of injury. Most injuries are either a result of training error and or running mechanics, and running mechanics is a major one. And there have been studies that found even a reduction of up to 62% chance of injury with better form. And the highest risk is with new runners. 85% per year, roughly, have been noted to get injured. Usually, the injury risk increases with the longer distances as well. So, new runners are high at risk, and then those delving into half marathon, marathons, or even veterans at those distances are more at risk because it's just more time on the feet and legs, more time stressing all the systems of the muscles and joints. Most of us, we learn to walk and we learn to run just naturally, and it's kind of an innate thing. But over time, due to lifestyle with the shoes we wear, sitting a lot, or different work environment types things, the running form can sometimes deteriorate. And there's other things people can get born with and have to work on a mechanical level. But in a way, most kids learn to run perfectly fine. And so different factors as we get older can change our mechanics where we need to reassess and look because we're not static. Navigating an injury or lifestyle change or all sorts of things can subtly change form and expose vulnerabilities. Hence, it's a skill sometimes that has to not only be learned, but maintained or refined or assessed. Even as long as I've been running, I have to keep mindful of my form and checking it. We all have a different style. It's important to note that there's no one has perfect form. You can even look at professional runners and they don't necessarily have perfect form. But there are principles of movement and load tolerance, how the body handles basically the impact of the ground, which is a lot of stress shooting up the leg. And so optimizing form is about maximizing that elastic energy, using all the muscles and tissue at their best and how they're designed to function, especially some things like the Achilles tendon, which are very powerful and very unique to humans, And so you want to maximize those things because then resistance to fatigue, which then affects, as we discussed, speed and endurance. And it also resists injury because they're stronger and able to handle the stress of impact with each step. And so an important thing to frame that all with is like, okay, is there a better time to assess my form and start trying to adapt it? And I would generally say the best time is probably in the off season or pre getting into a race training schedule, especially for half and full marathons. It doesn't mean it's too late halfway through to assess and adapt. A lot of people that come to work with Eric or then even me might be in the middle of a cycle of training and are dealing with injury issues, and that's part of the discovery of why is their injury occurring, and it's because of their form. And so then we need to try to safely and quickly start identifying the root problem and addressing it, which is a combination of rest and strengthening and then some other adaptations. So the ideal is before you really delve into all that training time, allowing time for just all the adjustments, which it does take time. It's not something that happens quickly necessarily, depending on the person and depending on what needs to be adjusted. So that's the ideal in the off season, but any time can be a good time. So some common errors identified by research, by my own experience, from Eric's, there are some trends we definitely see and are common areas that we look at first when we're assessing form. And these things will slow people down and lead to injury. One of the biggest ones is overstriding. A lot of that's defined by, you can look at the shin angle. Is the shin angled backwards towards the person, which usually is most obviously shown through like striking on the heel. What that's doing is not only kind of like hitting the brakes, but it's also basically removing all the power potential of the Achilles tendon and some of the calf muscles. It's like running on peg legs, wooden legs versus like springs. That's a lot of stress. So it can cause shin splint issues, it can cause knee pain issues, it can cause any number of issues. And sometimes these things work in partnership. It's not just one thing. Hip and knee collapse is a really common one as well. You can either see knees knocking against each other because hip and glute strength is weak. Ankle collapse can be connected to how the shin's coming down. That can also influence shin splints. A little less common, but it also is related to sometimes arch strength. And some people's arches have gotten very weak because of the nature of shoes and how cushy they are. And so a weak arch can then collapse and stress the ankle, which then can stress the shin, and it just works up the leg. The last two are a little less important if you were to rank the priority of these, looking at, is there a lot of bounce occurring? Because that's an inefficiency of energy usually. Or just what are the arms doing? I always say the arms basically guide or direct running. And so people that run with their arms going across their chest, they're sending energy towards the side or are rotating their body in certain ways that's reducing, again, speed, maybe less influencing injury, but certainly performance and sometimes others. So a key solution is often improving cadence. That addresses a lot of these things. And cadence just means how quick are your steps striking the ground. And that immediately addresses the biggest one there, overstriding. So one brief example where sometimes speed is not necessarily fully impacted, but it can be potentially. I worked with a young runner who ultimately was a 408 miler, so very fast, higher echelon. But you can even see in this image where his foot is striking, which is overstriding slightly. Not as much as some people, but you can see that the shin angle is backwards a little bit, and he's just essentially removed the power of his Achilles and calf muscles a bit. But obviously still able to move quite fast despite that. But he was one that was very prone to shin splint issues. And when he ran that 408 time, we actually had to be working with the bike a lot just because he was dealing with the pain. So we got him there, but his vulnerability was because of that overstriding and that heel strike and a number of other things that was holding him back maybe from even being faster than that. So being slow doesn't mean your form is bad necessarily. Being fast doesn't mean your form is great necessarily. It's looking particularly at injury patterns or if it's just people that want to sharpen their speed. But most people that benefit or need the form analysis are those struggling with pain that's holding them back. So to talk about the components of good running form, and then I want to break it down and show examples from some images and video of myself who also doesn't have perfect form. Posture is a big one we start with. That's a simple one. Tall, straight, that influences our airways and how we're able to breathe, but also helping make sure our center of mass is below our hips. Cadence has been mentioned. Rhythm is huge. There's debate about what's the best steps per minute. It's kind of relative to the person and their biomechanical composition, but somewhere between 160 to 200 can be the optimum. One way to practice that is with a jump rope. It's really hard to overstride or have too slow of a cadence when you're jump roping. Braking force, how the foot is striking the ground, is also a critical point we look at because that contact point is where the most stress is being received by the body, and then it dissipates up the kinetic chain. And so that usually begins with our foot, how the foot is striking, whether it's a forefoot, midfoot, or a heel. There's a lot of different application drills to improve that, but a good metaphor is if you think of those like little push scooters that kids like to ride, pushing off the ground. It's hard to overstride or heel strike and be on a scooter efficiently. Usually you're pushing off that forefoot. And it's kind of the same with running. Mentioned pelvic drop, looking at someone from the front. Is there a collapse in the hips on the right or left? That can indicate things and cause injury issues or slower form. And then or start affecting the knees, particularly. Knees and hips are often related in what's going on. As I mentioned also, rotation, arm motion influences a lot of the efficiency of speed. They're basically counteracting or balancing what's happening with our legs. Basic principles, keeping arms at like 90% at the most or a little less and moving forward back because then that's directing us forward. And our arms are a whole nother gear of speed. From a performance standpoint, strong arms is just helping with that speed, especially with sprinting or uphills or just general balance. And then finally, vertical oscillation, just minimizing head bobbing. This is more fine tuning, but we want our energy moving us forward and we don't want to be wasting it with too much upward motion. That's less common. I don't see that as much, but it's still something to be aware of. So let's make this a little more visual to help understand and kind of give you a sense of, as a coach, what I start looking at when I'm helping someone with their form assessment. Again, nobody has perfect form, but I think the important thing is understanding our vulnerabilities is half the battle. Once we understand that, we can start doing things to help strengthen and correct it and just be attuned to our bodies to have warning signs because our bodies are always communicating to us. And when we start feeling any pain, our body's telling us something. And Eric's done a whole workshop just on pain and how it communicates. And definitely recommend you check that out to delve deeper into that subject. But at a basic level with form analysis, we're looking at from a video of the front and then the side. That gives us generally enough information to work with. I use the video, slow it down, and then I eventually take key still shots. So I'll show you an example of all that with my own form. And so things that I generally initially look at kind of at the bigger level is the cadence. How is the foot strike? Is there any head bobbing? So here's a quick example of what a video might look like once I've looked at it, compiled it, and slowed it down. I'm already seeing a little bit of what I would call a single track running. But then looking at the side, I'm like, okay, am I overstriding it all? Arms are generally good, posture generally good. Though when I look at myself sideways, my head could probably be back a little bit, a little slouched, but generally okay. But it's hard to assess perfectly with a video, even with slow motion. We move on, and I'll start doing still shots and really looking at it and breaking it down. And I go over this with someone when they do the form analysis, looking at things like stable hips. When I look at those still shots especially, is there any collapse occurring? What are the knees doing? How are the arms rotating? So, okay, let's start breaking it down. I can see already there might be a little bit of a single track occurring with my feet. But even before that, one of the first things to look at is that impact force. What is my foot doing? If I focused in on the foot, it's striking a little bit outside, which is common, pronation. And that's in part because my physical form, my shins are a little bowed. So they, in a sense, are forcing my foot to hit at an outside angle. And that puts a lot of stress potentially on the ankle and arches. And I've had, particularly on the left side, more injury issues with sometimes shin splints, usually from training error. But training error often exposes our vulnerabilities in form. And so my shin angle is bringing my foot down at an angle that's going to have to adapt in such a way that the ankle is, you can see, moving down a little bit more rigorously than probably would be ideal. But I've also worked hard to strengthen my arches to handle that and my shins and calves. So generally I'm okay, but it is a vulnerability that I have to be mindful of. So you can again see that slight ankle going down. as opposed to staying steady. Hips otherwise, generally solid, so not as much concern there. And I look at both sides because sometimes one side's solid and one side's less solid. We usually have a weaker side. So again, bow-legged, a little bit in the shin, a little more ankle collapse, perhaps a little less pronounced pronation or outer foot strike on that right leg, which fits my history of pain and injury. Again, looking at posture, and this particularly applies to the side view. Am I standing up straight? Am I leaning slightly forward, not bent at the hips? Where is my foot contacting the ground? Is it overstriding at all? Or is it striking under my center of gravity, which would be like below the hips? I really hone it down in the video to see where there's a contact point and then where the weight really comes down. So like the foot here is contacting maybe a little bit of an overstride, like a little bit in front of me, but the shin is practically straight up. So it's really close. The weight comes down here. So the foot contact could be better, it could be a little farther back, but at least the weight generally is right below the hips back. I'm slouching a little bit. I think that could be a little better, but I can see generally good form there. Though I also know I've been dealing with some foot issues that I think is a result of that slight overstriding on my left leg. Whereas the right leg is contacting ground in this case a little bit better, but also a little bit more of an angle and more almost back from the toe versus this. And so it's just stressing things slightly different. It's just helping me understand why I might be feeling certain pain on one side versus the other. But again, center of mass seems to be balanced over from a foot strike perspective. I don't show it fully here, but something else I look at. If you look at the back leg, this is something common, is that people actually, their foot, when it drives forward, is just above the ground versus mine. If we went back to the video or I showed you more images, that knees and that foot actually generally stay about that high in the drive forward, which just helps maximize efficiency of form. And just to show an example again, contact point between my other runner and myself, more center of gravity in my case than his, even though he's a much faster runner than me. So there's a performance enhancement element of it, but there's also the injury side. And for him, there were a lot of injury issues, and this is a big reason why. When we do a running form analysis, we're doing it live on a video too, discussing the videos that were provided and assessed. And there's further drills we look at to see how is knee stability, how is the arch stability, hip stability, etc. Just to highlight some barriers to changing form. This is from actually research and from my own experience. The individual owner is the main factor. How motivated is the person to improve their form and work at it? Because it takes work and it's a little frustrating sometimes. How challenging the running technique can also be a factor. Some things are easier to correct than others. So Eric and I try to work with someone in stages sometimes to like suggest focus on this. Here's the secondary and here's the tertiary priority. It's almost like learn to ride a bike again because it's a skill and it can feel overwhelming. And so sometimes you have to focus on one thing at a time and build from there. It takes a lot of patience and motivation. And then there can be short-term challenges, like you can feel like you're awkward or performance can feel like it's declining. This is a running example of Steph Curry, one of the best basketball players of our time. Apparently he used to shoot when he was younger from the chest, which is less effective in his sport. And so started developing the proper shooting technique, but his performance plummeted and people questioned his future and all kinds of things, I think at a high school, collegiate level. But the long-term benefits ultimately paid off, obviously. So it takes a lot of patience, motivation, maybe ignoring criticism, because another thing can be the environment. Other runners, other coaches who have a negative feedback to that process or otherwise. So it's a very psychological as well as technical process of improvement. There can even be in extremes where someone gets over conscious of improving their form, which has its own sometimes negative effects. So it's a fine balance, again, that we're not going to be perfect. We do want to sharpen and improve our form, be aware of our vulnerabilities, but realize we're not going to be absolutely perfect. And so there's a point at which it's important just to run and enjoy running and relax and not overstress the form. So how do we begin to optimize that form? I mean, besides getting feedback, because we can't perfectly assess ourselves like in the moment. We need to see ourselves externally, whether it's someone filming and you trying to assess yourself, or usually most effectively having professionals who know exactly what to look at, like a coach, physical therapist, look at that and give feedback. But I think it fundamentally begins with building awareness and having the patience, and that takes mental focus, resilience, adaptation. Often in part of the process, and feedback will give, and this is subjective to the individual and what they need, is there might be and often are muscle groups or joint groups that are weak and they just need to be strengthened. And that actually improves a lot. So that's in some sense simpler. That's one of the simpler steps, is just strengthening muscles to both be resilient as well as support what needs to be done. The harder part can be the motor control, just how the brain is controlling the fine tuning, like the angles. And there's drills to refine that and just practice in running and practice in other ways that I usually use with athletes that are just part of warm ups and cool downs that can help both with injury prevention and reaffirming good mechanics. Mobility is a factor. I say mobility specifically versus flexibility. Flexibility is kind of synonymous, but if you're really tight and your joints are restricted, they're just not going to be able to move in their fullest, freest range of motion, and or the tissue won't be as elastic or resilient to stress. And so mobility achieved through stretching, particularly like dynamic stretching, but even passive stretching at the end of a workout, has its place to help optimize form. It's amazing how many people are just very immobile or inflexible who are runners, built up over how they're sitting at work all day or whatever. And then just training, practicing it, getting out there. Performance is a result of endurance plus speed plus strength, not one of those by themselves. They all interact and have to influence each other to have the optimal performance. We've delved into each of these subjects specifically. That's why I won't go into great detail now, but I have videos on drills that can be done. And we did a whole workshop on strength, Eric and I. We did a whole workshop on mobility. We have workshops on training for different races. And we've had great psychologists and counselors talk about the psychological side of running. So all these have been delved into specifically each in their own way, but I want to highlight those things. Like these are all factors that influence how we optimize our running form. And you can start doing it just yourself and start learning. We have put together free virtual assessments that just starts looking at your basic postural strength and flexibility and motor control. And you can start assessing yourself and seeing if there's any obvious ways that are weak or vulnerable, and then have ways to start strengthening or improving the flexibility or motor control of those things. Like I mentioned, the ankle collapse can be a major factor that then yanks on or essentially stresses the shin a fair amount, and that can lead to things like shin splints or worse. And a way to begin addressing that is just a strong arch. Sometimes there can be foot issues, but they're a little less common. Plantar fasciitis can be connected sometimes to how the foot angle is moving across the ground or even up the connect chink. Sometimes people's feet and shins are resilient, but then the pain gets up to their knees and starts causing problems there otherwise. So it can really be any number of things, but I'd say most commonly the pronation, if it doesn't have the stability of a good arch, can lead to a lot of shin issues. That's what I've seen the most personally. It can. I mean, realizing that we don't always take the exact same step every time, especially if in trail running or on uneven terrain. But it can suggest that single track, or it could be just how it's moving forward in the forward drive. Maybe the foot's just coming in too much. And that could be from any number of things that start at the hips, because usually the hips are controlling and guiding that knee drive. And so during that, again, any number of things, but it does suggest something's not aligned, but it also may not be a problem unless you've had pain. Again, I think pain is the biggest indication that something's definitely not right. And then others might just want to, sharpen it and prevent ever dealing with pain, which is good. It's good that you're starting to pay attention to that, because then you're starting to become aware of what is my body doing and how could that possibly affect me down the road. It might not be affecting you now, but maybe later. I don't know if it's as much as necessarily the surface, though. Certainly, the harder the surface, then in some sense, the stronger the impact force. A smooth grass or a dirt trail is going to be, in a way, gentler in the stress that the foot is receiving upon impact. But I would say the bigger factors of prevention splints are training error, for one, having a proper progression. Where that leads to injury usually is people going too fast, too much mileage too soon. And so there's the tissue is just simply overwhelmed and can't handle it. It doesn't matter what terrain you're running on. And even you can have good form, but if there's a vulnerability already from arches being weak or shins or calves being weak, then it can expose that. Or many times people are not making training errors and they just keep getting held back because of pain, which then is clearly more of a form issue. And it can be weaknesses in the glutes, it can be weaknesses in the upper legs, but I think a lot of it can start with the feet and how the feet are interacting upon impact. So looking at the arches, one of the first things I do with anyone who has had shin pain, and I work up the leg from there and start assessing everything, seeing what is the knee angle, because sometimes your arch might be good, like mine is, but my shin angles and how I'm hitting the ground put more stress at certain points. And so it's somewhat subjective still, but it's looking at angles is looking at strength, because if something's weak, it will either get overworked itself or something else will compensate for it, and that will get overworked. So sometimes you might be having shin pain, and it's not that the shin or the calf is weak or the problem, but something else is failing in the process, which, like I said, is often the arch in shin splints as an example. What I do love about trails or less consistently even surfaces like a road is that because you have to land slightly different every time, it mixes up the stress point slightly. And if you're generally strong enough in terms of tissue, that can be nice versus going on a road, which you're generally landing exactly the same way every time. Granted, though, trails also bring their own risks if they're really rocky and rooted. Hitting those things in a bad way can cause their own problems. But there's a chronic injury, which is something that creeps in over time, versus an acute, which is a sudden, like, oh, I hit that root really badly and that immediately hurt. That's an acute injury. That's contextual, not so much related to form per se, versus I've been running fine over a road or smooth trails and pain has just been creeping in. I've not personally tried to calculate my VO2 max. It's an interesting analytic, but I know a lot of people are using smart-based watches for like heart rate-based training, and that can be really good and informative, but I think the formulas they're using are very basic. They're still very limited in terms of guiding training. Perceived effort and pace are actually a little more objective. I think sometimes short term there can be setbacks, either feeling different kinds of pain or discomfort or over consciousness of form or declined performance maybe. That's why it's best usually in the off season when you're not worrying so much about performance, you're just focusing on base training. But no, generally everyone I've worked with who's motivated and kept with it made improvements and lowered some injury issues. But again, it's a process. It's not like you do it once and it's done and you're set. Like it's ongoing maintenance or feedback sometimes. My basic answer would be the training. Form is the fine tuning, but without the training, it doesn't really matter about form as much. They partner together well. If you have a certain goal, there's a progression to get there in a safe way that's lowered risk of injury, but also to develop all those systems like VO2 max to handle the stress of that goal pace. It's very nuanced based on the runner's background, where is their current fitness, and what is their goal. Everybody has a different starting place to work from.